Another brilliant Grand Prix in this 2022 season, and it was a win for Verstappen and Red Bull at Ferrari's home race, which will make that victory that bit sweeter for the world champion. There was a lot of action over the sprint weekend in Italy, including an absolute disaster for Ferrari. So here's my 5 things we learned from the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. A win in the opponent's backyard. It was a strong weekend for Max Verstappen, with a pole position in qualifying, followed by a strong performance in the sprint, and then a dominant display in the changeable conditions of Sunday's Grand Prix. It was a great performance, and a very quiet one, as he barely got any TV time as Perez defended so well from Leclerc behind and allowed the Dutchman to disappear off into the distance, and for Red Bull to achieve their first 1-2 finish since 2016. And Verstappen was absolutely dominant. He lapped the vast majority of runners before he made his second stop. It was a cool, calm and collected performance from Max, as he was so comfortable out at the front, even to the point where he was politely requesting a pit stop once he knew the cars behind him had also stopped. It was the complete opposite of some of the radio messages we had heard from Verstappen at other races of this season, where he's let his anger get the better of him, particularly after his unfortunate DNFs in Bahrain and Australia. But today, it was one of those performances that showed that on his day, and with the right car, Verstappen is simply untouchable right now. And it seems like Red Bull have given him a car that could achieve that kind of result once again this year, which is something that's highly impressive given how tough that battle was last year. Without the DNFs, Verstappen could be so much closer to Leclerc, but he will certainly be able to catch up if he puts in performances like this one and his opponent falters as he did this afternoon in Italy. So it's clearly a green box for Max Verstappen for his performance at the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, and he was so far ahead of the opposition today, getting the win, the sprint race win, and the fastest lap to go on top. Heartbreak for Carlos Sainz. The driver that has rightly earned a new contract with Ferrari is going through the most unlucky period of his Formula 1 career right now. On Friday, Carlos Sainz pushed a bit too much in Q2, having set a good enough time, and ended up putting the Ferrari into the barrier. But despite this starting spot for Sainz, he had a strong sprint race, benefiting from the different race weekend format as it gave him an extra 21 laps to progress. He managed to do so and actually got himself up into 4th position, admittedly a long way back behind the front 3, but he did put himself in the best possible position to give himself a decent chance and compete with the Red Bulls and his Ferrari teammate Charles Leclerc. But for the second race in a row, Sainz ended up in the gravel right at the start of the race. On this occasion, he got off to a poor start and was tagged by Daniel Ricciardo into the opening chicane, and the contact spun the Spaniard round into the gravel, as he then spun up the rears and got beached. It was a heartbreak moment, as the driver who came into this season with a decent chance at competing for the championship has now found himself well down the order and well behind his teammate. He's had 2 DNFs in 4 races, and that has really left him in wingman territory. We know that Ferrari aren't afraid to make a second driver decision this early in the season. And given the performance from Verstappen and Red Bull today, and the fact that it is now 2 wins apiece for Verstappen and Leclerc, you have to assume that if a situation came up which would enable Leclerc to score more points, I think the Spaniard would be asked to move aside. It will be interesting to see what happens next with the Ferraris. I'm sure Sainz will be looking forward to another 2-week gap before the next race in Miami. But regardless, it is going to be difficult for Sainz to claw back a 48-point gap to Leclerc, even in the 19 races left of the season. So I'm going to give Sainz a green box, as in the race today there was nothing he could do. After the poor qualifying from the driver, he made up for it on Saturday and made sure he was there where he needed to be for the race, and ended up a passenger as he was spun off into the gravel. He's got a lot of catching up to do, and a lot to prove with the rest of this season, and I hope he gets the chance to prove himself again. Before we take a look at the other points of this weekend, including that mistake from Charles Leclerc, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already done so, do consider hitting the subscribe button. Thanks. Did the sprint race unravel a potentially great Grand Prix? This week was not only the first European race in 2022, but also the first sprint race of the year. And on Friday, there was a chaotic qualifying session with multiple red flags and changeable conditions. What this created was a mixed up grid, with Sainz in 10th, Norris in 3rd and Magnussen in 4th. It was lining up to be a great race, but the sprint seemed to unravel that wet qualifying result, with the top two teams setting up on the front two rows after the 21-lap race. Now you could argue that this is a real shame, as the sprint left the drivers like Kevin Magnussen outside of the position that he could have so easily benefited from in the changeable conditions of the race, had the qualifying result have stood for the starting lineup on Sunday. However, at the same time, that qualifying result from changeable conditions would have been unlikely if qualifying had taken place in the dry conditions of Saturday, so the sprint weekend format actually enabled that jumbled up grid in the first place. I agree it would have been really exciting to see the race with that mixed up grid, and seeing the likes of Sainz charging up the order from 10th position in the wet. But in the end, we still had a great Grand Prix on Sunday, with changeable conditions and the likes of Norris, Bottas and Russell making their way up the order. So the sprint weekend format actually enabled an exciting sprint and an exciting weekend on the whole, in my opinion. Spreading the competitive running over 3 days when there were different weather conditions over the course of the weekend means that it's more exciting for the fans. Had this been a standard race weekend, there might not have been as much running at all on Friday, which would have made it far less interesting. Having said this, I do tend to prefer the standard weekend of running, but I'm less against the sprint than I was a year ago. On a side note with the sprint, I think the introduction of more points for the top 8 finishing spots was a good addition, and calling pole position from the Friday result is a nicer outcome in my view as well. So on the whole, I actually think the sprint race deserves a green box for this week. I don't know if this will be a popular opinion, but I actually think it added to the excitement of the Emilia Romagna race weekend, and let's face it, it was a pretty awesome race anyway. Lando Norris maximising his car once again. I have to say, I've been amazed at just how quickly that McLaren car seems to have improved and developed over these last 4 races. It was in the Bahrain test that they identified that their brake ducts were not doing enough to cool the brakes in the hotter conditions. As a result, the team struggled in the first couple of races as they were hosted in the desert heat. But the race in Australia allowed the team to maximise their potential, scoring a strong double points finish. And once again at Imola, the McLaren car looked very strong, with a brilliant qualifying performance with Lando Norris in 3rd and 6th for Daniel Ricciardo. Yes, Norris dropped back a couple of positions in the sprint, but with a strong getaway in the race, he managed to get back to 3rd at the start of the race before then settling into 4th for the majority of the Grand Prix. This recovery from McLaren and Lando Norris in particular has been so impressive. The races in the slightly cooler conditions seem to play into the hands of the McLaren, as they do have a very strong car. It can compete with the likes of Mercedes through this season. I'm sure they'll be developing better brake ducts for the warmer races later in the year, so perhaps we could get used to seeing the McLaren well in the fight for the top 3 teams and be there to pick up the pieces whenever the teams ahead make mistakes. And that's exactly what Norris managed to do today, with a podium finish, his 2nd in a row at this track. It was a huge performance and a brilliant result for the team, as they seem to have gone from the back to the front in just 4 races. After that performance, it has to be a green box for Lando Norris. His performances at this track in the last couple of years have been excellent, and he's proving once again that he's the stronger driver at McLaren. The first mistake of 2022 for Charles Leclerc. Sergio Perez put in a masterclass to defend from Charles Leclerc throughout the race at Imola. It was a brilliant performance from the Mexican driver as he allowed his teammate to pull a huge gap on the rest of the field and go on to win in dominant fashion. But this defensive masterclass put so much pressure on the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc, to the extent that the Monegasque driver pushed too much, and ended up spinning off into the barrier and was forced into making another stop to replace his front wing. It was a huge moment for this championship. If last year taught us anything, it's that the smallest of mistakes can have huge consequences. Think back to the Azerbaijan race in 2021, where Hamilton made an error with the brake balance that meant he lost enough points that could have won him the title. Today's mistake cost Leclerc at least 7 points, which yes isn't a huge amount over a 23 race season, but regardless, it was a costly error. He remains at the top of the standings by 27 points, but he'll need to iron out those errors through the rest of the season if the Red Bulls can continue to show that they have a strong car as they have done this weekend. So overall, it's got to be a red box for Charles Leclerc, as an unforced error cost him dearly today. He's proving himself to be a championship contender for sure, and I have no doubt that he will bounce back this year, but it's not the way that he or Ferrari would have wanted their home Grand Prix to end. Honourable Mentions. There are more honourable mentions today than I think I've ever given before, with so many strong performances that I haven't been able to discuss through this video. From George Russell, who made great progress on lap 1 to get into the top 6 and was so far ahead of his teammate through the race, to Valtteri Bottas, who has once again proved himself in the Alfa Romeo, and then even Sebastian Vettel getting his and the Aston Martin team's first points of 2022 with 7th, and Lance Stroll getting a point for 10th. You then also have Yuki Tsunoda, delivering a great result in his AlphaTauri, being well ahead of his teammate, as Tsunoda finished 7th to Gasly's 12th. But I also want to comment on the delayed DRS enablement through the race, which came at over half race distance, after the teams had all switched on to the dry compound tyres. I suppose it was almost an experiment to see if these cars could overtake at a track that's traditionally been very difficult for overtaking, as they could see whether cars could follow each other easier. I think it was clear that they could follow easier, but at the same time, they weren't exactly making overtakes. It didn't really improve once DRS was enabled either, but I'd be interested to hear what Ross Brawn thought about the racing without DRS. So it was another awesome race for 2022, and this season is looking like it's going to be just as exciting as last year, with two young competitors battling for two different teams. All we need now is an on-track battle between the two of them in Miami.